everyone.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome back to our book club. I am Miss Maka.
I'm Mr. Darrell. Today, we are going to talk about a classic from British literature, Sense and Sensibility.
Yes, and the book is written by Jane Austen. But Mr. Darrell, before we start talking about the book itself, let's look at our agenda. So, the very first thing we are focused on is our vocabulary. Then we will talk about the author, Jane Austen. Later, we will talk about the summary of the book.
Then we'll talk about the characters. They move the summary along. We'll talk about some of the settings, the context of the book, and we'll finish off with some main themes of the book.
Yeah, but that's not the end of our program. We will finally conclude the whole program and then give you an interesting homework.
Very good. I'm looking forward to those answers.
Yes, definitely.
So we have vocabulary next. 8 words that we selected to focus on and that we mentioned and that is mentioned in the book as well. Okay, the first word on our list is dashing. Dashing. And the definition is someone, usually a man, handsome, attractive, energetic, lively.
მიმზიდველი, სიმპათიური.
Our next word is impoverished. Impoverished. This is when you are reduced to being poor, when you're poor.
ღარიბი, ღარიბული.
Next word, clandestine. Clandestine. When something is done in secrecy for the purposes of deceiving someone.
საიდუმლო, ფარული.
Next word, misjudgment. Misjudgment. This is when you judge something wrongly or you're mistaken about the value of this thing.
არასწორი აზრი, არასწორი წარმოდგენა.
Our next word, long-standing. Long-standing. Something that's been existing or continuing to exist for a long time.
ხანგრძლივი.
Our next word, limbo. Limbo. When you're in a state of unsureness about something, when you're in a situation where you don't know what's going to happen and you're kind of stuck.
გაურკვეველი მდგომარეობა.
Next word, discretion. Discretion. The power or right to decide or act on something when something is up to you to decide.
მოქმედების თავისუფლება, არჩევანის გაკეთების უფლება.
And our last word, to snub. Snub. This is when you treat with disdain or contempt somehow, especially by ignoring something.
დაიგნორება, არად ჩაგდება. Okay, Mr. Darrell, thank you very much. And now I think it's time to ask a question to our audience. So, give us an example of a job where you have to behave in a clandestine manner.
I think a good example of a job where you have to behave in a clandestine manner is a secret agent or spy.
Yeah, thank you very much. Exactly. They really need to have this kind of skill to keep secrets, right?
How else would James Bond do his duty?
Exactly. Thank you very much.
Well, let's move on to the author section now. As you know, our author of the day is Jane Austen. Recounting her birth and death, she was born in 1775 in Hampshire, and she died in 1817, the 19th century, in Hampshire as well. She was an English writer who gave the novel its first distinctly modern sort of character studies and themes about society.
And she published 4 novels during her lifetime: Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, and Emma. Her novels defined the manners of the era, so they described how people behaved in those days. But they also became very popular, timeless classics that remained critical and popular successes 2 centuries after her death.
She came from a large family, a family of 8, and the family amusement was basically acting to each other. Her closest companion happened to be one of her sisters, Cassandra, and they were very close, but neither of them married.
Yeah, but we could say one fact. She actually almost married Harry Speak Wither, a 21-year-old heir of Hampshire family. So he was considered to be quite handsome and quite intelligent. But the very next morning, Jane changed her mind.
Oh,
Yeah.
a little harsh.
Yes.
And there's supposedly mention of another possible love, but this one died very soon after they declared themselves.
Yeah. But what about Cassandra, her sister? She was a jealous guardian of her sister's private life. So she actually, after Jane's death, she censored the surviving letters by destroying them or cutting them up. So, but Jane Austen's own novels provide indisputable evidence that their author understood love and how love could disappoint.
Very good point. Jane's family life is what shapes her in a large way, and that gives her the context for her writing as well. The years after 1811 seem to have been the most rewarding of her life. She had success, she had adulation, and she knew that all of her novels were popular.
Yeah, for the last 18 months of her lifetime, she was very busy writing. She died of the Addison's disease, and later, 6 days later, she was buried in Winchester Cathedral.
Okay, very good. Now, we've got a question for our audience. If you were a writer, what would be the most rewarding thing for you to see happen?
Well, I would be happy to see people discussing my work and relating themselves to it.
That is a great answer. Who else wouldn't be happy with positive feedback?
Of course, everyone wants generally feedback, and especially positive one. Okay, now let's move on to the summary part. What is the story about? So when Mr. Dashwood dies, his ex-wife and 3 children, Eleanor, Marianne, and Margaret, are sad to learn that they have to live on a very small amount of money.
And now Edward Ferrar comes to stay with them, and a friendship develops between Edward and Eleanor. And Fanny does everything she can to prevent it from developing.
Marianne meets the older Colonel Brandon, who falls in love with her at the very first sight. But competing with him for her affection is the dashing but deceitful John Willoughby, who actually steals Marianne's heart.
Soon another girl enters the story, Lucy Steele. She confides in Eleanor that she and Edward had become secretly engaged 5 years earlier. And Eleanor knows that there's no chance of relationship between her and Edward now.
Yes, and Edward's and Lucy's relationship becomes known. And when her mother also learns about it, she actually demands from him to break up this engagement. But when he refuses, his fortune is taken from him and given to his younger brother, Robert.
Now, Marianne mysteriously becomes ill and is nursed back to health by Eleanor at this point. After Marianne recovers, the sisters learn that Mrs. Steele has become Mrs. Ferrars. And they assume initially that means she's been married to Edward Ferrars, but unexpectedly, she married the brother, Robert.
Edward is thus released from his engagement. Edward proposes to Eleanor and becomes a vicar, while Marianne falls in love with and marries Colonel Brandon.
And the very end of the novel, which is kind of important because we'll talk about it later, Mr. Willoughby is left looking at his mansion, wondering why he chose money over love with Marianne.
Okay, yeah, that's the end of our short summary. So now let's ask a question to our lovely audience. So we know that Willoughby chooses money over love. What does this behavior tell you about his personality?
I think that he is not a romantic, he is a materialistic.
Yes, good answer. That's exactly the situation.
Of course, when you choose money or other materialistic stuff over love, of course it means that you are materialistic.
Okay. And it seems that Jane Austen doesn't approve of this.
Yeah, we can say that. Okay, Mr. Darrell, now I think it is time to introduce to our characters.
Let's get to it. The main character, the protagonist, if you will, is Eleanor Dashwood, the 19-year-old daughter of the Dashwood family, and she is the heroine, basically. She's composed, she's affectionate, she falls in love with Edward, and she's very close to her sister Marianne.
Yeah, and as you already mentioned, Sister Marianne is our next character. She is a 17-year-old girl. She's quite sensible and intelligent and romantic, but her idealism leads her to fall in love with the wrong guy, so she makes a wrong choice, poor choice. And this is John Willoughby. He rejects her, causing her to finally recognize her misjudgment of him. After this turn of heart, she ultimately marries her long-standing admirer. This is Colonel Brandon.
Excellent. Let's move on to two brothers now, and I'll speak about Edward.
Yeah.
Edward is the sensible and friendly older brother. He develops a close relationship with Eleanor, and he ultimately marries her after he's freed from a secret engagement with Lucy Steele.
Yeah, and of course, after Edward, we should definitely meet his younger brother. This is Robert Ferrars. He is a conceited younger brother of his. Robert inherits his mother's fortune after she disinherits Edward. And do you know what is really funny and ironical? He ultimately marries Lucy Steele, even though it was Edward's engagement, to this same woman that caused his mother to disinherit him.
Pretty ironic.
Yeah.
Okay, and our last character, John Willoughby. It's worth mentioning something about him because we will bring up a few themes later on that deal with him. So he's an attractive but deceitful young man who wins Marianne's heart, but then abandons her selfishly, greedily, in favor of the wealthy Miss Sophia Grey.
Yeah, so after listening to these character descriptions, we can see that there are lots of drama and stories happening, but of course the ending is a pretty happy one.
So despite all the psychological drama, Jane does prefer happy endings.
Yes. Now, Mr. Darrell, I think it's time for our question from the character part.
Yes, we have this question for you. What is the difference between the two pairs of sisters, Eleanor and Marianne?
Well, in my opinion, Eleanor is more rational and reasonable, but her sister Marianne is more emotional and spontaneous.
Very good answer. Yeah, that is the basic difference between the two sisters.
Yes, Mr. Darrell, and now we have the second question from the character part. But in this case about the brothers. What is the difference between Robert and Edward?
Well, in my point of view, Edward is very sensible and friendly, but his younger brother, Robert, is very conceited and proud.
Great answer.
Yeah.
That's also basically the difference between the two brothers.
Yes, so but we can see the negative and positive sides of these two brothers,
Both
right?
characters, yeah. Okay, I think it's time to move on to the setting of the story. Now, let's look at the when. It is the early 19th century, and Austen's particular moment in history is an interesting one. Her novels are dealing with the strange interactions between people of different social classes and levels, which is a kind of relatively new development in England at the time.
Yes, and her books are firmly planted in the bourgeoisie, and this class, she also describes that was on the up and up, as she wrote. None of her characters in the Sense and Sensibility are firmly planted in the upper echelons of the high society. Even the wealthiest ones are not integrated into aristocratic social circles.
And the Dashwoods are of the middle class, and it's not easy for them. You can see that they're struggling to stay up, to go up, and sometimes they go down.
Yeah, and of course the locations are very important and interesting to look at. So this novel moves between town and a country, just as most of the people did in Jane Austen's time.
But she is very concerned with social class of her characters, and her settings reveal this well, I think.
Yeah, and Barton is a countryside, and our main characters actually live in the shadow of the landed gentry.
It's notable, by the way, that Eleanor and Marianne are always on the outskirts of people who move back and forth between London and Devonshire. They themselves aren't well off, but they are dependent on wealthier connections, perhaps relatives, perhaps neighbors, who are moving upwards.
Yeah, so we can see that these networks and connections really were very helpful in those days.
Yeah.
Okay, I think it's time for our question, Mr. Darrell.
Okay, let's ask a question to our audience. Now, in today's era, do you think that girls would be as focused on choosing marriage for social status as they are in Jane Austen's books?
No, I don't think so. I think today girls have more freedom and opportunity to focus on themselves and their interests first, rather than security from marriage.
Very good answer. Yeah, it's an opinion, but I think a good one.
Yeah, like definitely modern time girls don't really need any security from marriage, right?
There are more opportunities, more social mobility as well.
Of course, yeah. And now we have the second question from the setting part. Why does Jane Austen want to focus on so much on the social status?
Looking at the end of the story, people who choose love over money ends up regretting it. So Jane Austen tries to change the situation.
Very good answer. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. Okay, and now it's time to talk about the main themes of the book, right? So the first main theme that we have chosen for you is expectation and disappointment. Throughout the novel, we can see that many characters develop expectations based on a very little evidence or faulty perceptions. This of course leads to disappointment, as reality proves very different.
Yeah, joyful expectations are constantly being dashed by turns of events in this book. One very good example is Marianne, her love for Willoughby being spurned, thrown away, and we have to wonder about that.
Yeah, exactly. We can clearly see that, according to this book, of course, you shouldn't expect much, especially when there is little evidence in reality, right, to be happy or to expect that. Okay, what about the second main theme? This is money and inheritance. So laws surrounding inheritance are what make Dashwood girls suffer at the very beginning of the novel, and their lack of money, compounded with their inability to work, means that they cannot use their situation except through marrying well.
And it really is money that dictates the eligibility for marriage of Eleanor and Marianne. Their prospects for marriage depend on how much money they have, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. So we can see a problem of materialism here. Yeah, surely. And what about the following main theme, again chosen by us? Of course, we would like to remind you that there can be lots of themes that you can read there, some hidden messages, but these are things that we have chosen for you. This is discretion. Of the utmost importance in polite society, it is very important to have some manners and to be able to know what are the things that you can let people know and what are the things that you should really hide from them.
I guess it wouldn't be a Jane Austen novel without discretion. It's Marianne's lack of discretion that leads to a great deal of gossip and a very public snubbing by Willoughby.
Yes, Daryl, and not only gossiping, but lack of discretion in many other activities and behavior. It also indicates poor manners and a lack of refinement.
Well said, Ms. Maka. Now, I think we've got a question for the audience. Here it is. Because modern society is so free, do you think that there's less discretion in our lives today?
Yes, I think so. I mean, there is less discretion, but we have some social standards and that everyone follows. Just because we are freer nowadays does not mean that we don't have standards.
That's a great answer, Ms. Maka.
Yeah, so even now we have some standards that we have to follow, definitely.
It's a more modern time, but nothing really changes.
Not much. Okay, now let's wrap up everything what we've told today, right? So as you remember, Mr. Daryl, and of course our audience will remember, we started talking about the author, Jane Austen.
And then we moved to the summary of the book, which is obviously these sisters and the love stories, very complicated, that develops between several characters.
Yeah, and mentioning characters, we had two sisters, we focused on two sisters and two brothers in our character list.
From there, we looked at the setting. As you remember, it's the early 19th century, and the place is Devonshire, England.
Yes, and of course we focused on the main themes that were expectation and disappointment, money and inheritance, and discretion.
Okay, one last time, let's move over the vocabulary list quickly, I think. First word, dashing.
მიმზიდველი, სიმპათიური.
Next word, impoverished.
ღარიბი, ღარიბული.
Next word, clandestine.
საიდუმლო, ფარული.
Next word, misjudgment.
არასწორი აზრი, არასწორი წარმოდგენა.
Next word, long-standing.
ხანგრძლივი,
Next word, limbo.
გაურკვეველი მდგომარეობა.
Next, discretion.
მოქმედების თავისუფლება, არჩევანის გაკეთების უფლება.
And last, to snub.
დაიგნორება, არად ჩაგდება. Thank you, Mr. Daryl. Now it is high time to talk about our homework.
Yes, we have a question today that we'd like you to answer. And here it is. Imagine that you have to move to another town or city in Georgia. Where would you go and why? And please describe the area as well.
წარმოიდგინეთ, რომ საქართველოს სხვა ქალაქში გიწევთ საცხოვრებლად გადასვლა. სად გადახვიდოდით და რატომ? აღწერეთ ახალი გარემო.
And please send your answers to the address shown on the screen.
გამოაგზავნეთ დავალებები ეკრანზე მითითებულ მისამართზე.
Well, Ms. Maka, that was a great discussion on Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility.
Exactly. I loved the stories and I loved the love triangles here happening in the story.
I liked the answers as well from our audience.
Oh, and of course we should thank them for those interesting answers. Thank you very much. And I guess that's all for today. We'll have to say goodbye and see you next week.
Have a great week. Goodbye.
Goodbye.